So Socrates is asked, what is the Hoseion? And Euthyphro in about 5d9 offers his first response. He says something like this. Oh, well, I'll tell you what the Hoseion is, Socrates. It's just what I'm doing right now, is prosecuting a wrongdoer, right? As he said, he's prosecuting his father for the wrongful killing of the servant, and so that's that's a pious thing to do. That is the Hoseion. That's an example of the Hoseion right there. Notice I said example, and so Socrates asked for a definition, and what did he get back? He got an example, and as a matter of fact, he got two examples. So the Hoseion is to prosecute the wrongdoer, and the wrongdoer, and the anhoseion would be to not prosecute the wrongdoer. So there you go. There's your answer, Socrates, says Euthyphro. I'll give you an example. So Socrates says, well, okay, I'm not denying that those are examples of the Hoseion, but that's not quite what I asked, right? So here we have the issue of Socrates rejecting an example as an answer to a question, what is? So in that sense, there's a presupposition, right? And we often do this when we ask questions. Questions are all, in a sense, loaded, right? You know, normally we think of, oh, you should never ask loaded questions because we watch, courts and lawyers on TV when they ask a loaded question. It's like, when did you stop killing people or something, really loaded like that. But all questions are kind of loaded, right? Because they presuppose at least the form of an answer. And Socrates is saying, hey, you're not answering the question in the way that you're supposed to. So there's a presupposition by Socrates in there. And you'll see Geach and Santos fight about exactly how that works. But for now, Socrates says, look, I asked you a question of a definition, and you gave me an example. I asked, what is the Hoseion? And you gave me an example of a Hoseion, right? Is that really the answering my question? Socrates, seems to reject the notion of examples as answering questions of definition. So there's a bit of chatting about that, and Euthyphro here, so when Euthyphro gives this prosecution of wrongdoer and not to, that's when you get that little story, right? So then you get his reference to the myth, and we talked about that myth of Uranus, Kronos, and Zeus, and he justifies it. He says, look, everyone agrees that Zeus did the right thing by, not just prosecuting his dad. Zeus killed Kronos, right? And we think that's okay. So there you go. Well, if the gods can do it, so there's a parallel, right? If the gods can do it, then I'm doing pretty well the same kind of thing. So if the gods can depose a father who's done something wrong, then I can sue my father who has done something wrong. So basically, there you go. It works out nice and tidy. So go and refresh your memory about that myth in the previous video, if this part is unfamiliar to you. So Socrates, that's where Socrates, gets himself into a little bit of hot water. You can see with Athenian society, because he's like, I don't know, this stuff sounds kind of goofy, all these gods and whatnot. And Socrates is not terribly impressed by this answer for a number of reasons. He finds the stories hard to believe, and Socrates says that can we do better than this? I want a definition, not an example. And so Euthyphro, keeping with the God kind of style of answering, right, the religious kind of answer, he says, okay, if an example's not going to work, then I'm going to try a different thing. So Euthyphro's second response to the question, what is the Hoseion? Keep that in mind. Don't lose sight of what the main thrust of the dialogue is to articulate what the Hoseion is. So Euthyphro says, okay, well, the Hoseion is what is dear to the gods, right? So what the gods like, what they love, what is God loved. So the Hoseion, it's what's dear to the gods, what's loved, and the anhoseion, rather than these examples, the anhoseion is what is not dear, what the gods don't like. So the notion of the Hoseion turns on this external element. Like, so there's the Hosean over there, and the gods are like, yeah, we like that. So their liking something makes it the Hosean. So what's dear to the gods? And Socrates thinks that, well, we're that this is a little better. Okay, this is, but Socrates says, wait a second. Now, if you know a little bit more about Greek myths, the gods disagreed. Remember when I said, for example, that they took sides in a war? They didn't all take the same side. So in Homer, for instance, different gods took different sides between in that war between the Greeks and the Trojans. So wait a second, gods disagree. Some gods may have thought certain things were okay, and the next god would have thought that very same thing was wrong. And Socrates says, wait a second, I didn't ask you what could be both Hosean and Hosean. For instance, we could find something that's dear to some of the gods, so that would make it Hosean, and that very same thing might not be dear to other gods. Well, then that would make it Anhosean. So something could be both Hosean and not Hosean in this way of reasoning, right? Just like some people like chocolate. I guess there's some people that don't. But think of something that lots of people like and lots of people dislike. There you go. So if you say, oh, I'm going to define it in terms of being liked, well, you could easily find one thing that's liked by some, not liked by others. So it's both. Socrates is saying, no, it's got to be one or the other. So this way of discussion is not going to work, right? So we have shall we say, a second failure. And so this is an example of Socrates kind of turning the tables on Euthyphro, saying, look, you're saying that you, for instance, Socrates says, look, if we look at that myth about Zeus killing Kronos, then yeah, according to some, that would have been a good thing. But not everybody would agree. Not every god would have agreed with that. So Socrates takes Euthyphro's own discussion and tries to use it against him. And that is sort of a tables turning argument. You find those kinds of arguments quite often in Plato's dialogues, and it's often referred to as the peritrope argument, which is a table turning argument. So turning the tables, we often talk about that in rhetoric, using someone's argument against them. It's a kind of ad hominem, but it's not an attack against the person. It's just it's turning an argument back on the speaker. Also, there's an early appearance here of in Socrates' discussion. So I want you to pay attention to that, because Socrates points out that what exactly do we argue about, right? And he makes a distinction between factual questions and moral questions. This is an early appearance of this distinction. And whether or not it's a perfectly good distinction is debatable. Yeach, as you'll see, will debate whether or not this is a good distinction to make. But Socrates, for our discussion now, makes the distinction that there are certain kinds of questions, like factual questions, we don't debate. We and he uses the example of, if we debate about how far it is between two objects, or whatever, you go out and measure them. You don't argue about it, you measure. So there are certain physical type questions or factual questions. Those are not a matter of debate. But other questions, like moral questions, you can't really measure in. There's no procedure. So there's a procedure to answer factual questions, and there's not really a procedure to answer, questions of the good and beautiful and moral. So that distinction between methodology in one case and methodology and no methodology in the other, this is an early appearance of that distinction. So this kind of he's backed Euthyphro into a bit of a corner. So what we've got is, well, the first response is gone. The second response is kind of in trouble. So we're going to look at a modified second response by Euthyphro to the general question of our dialogue. Once again, what is Hosean?